Hello, my name is TJ Walker, and welcome to this episode of Renew. Renew is a show about the College of Forest Resources at Mississippi State University. The College of Forest Resources works to promote and enable the conservation, management, and wise use of our diverse natural resources. Within our college, we have 3 departments, and today we're going to learn a little bit more about the Department of Forestry. Representing that department today is Assistant Professor Dr. Christine Fortune. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So we'll dive right into our conversation. So first question, tell me a little bit more about yourself and how did you find your way to Mississippi State?
Well, I have a multidisciplinary background.
Okay.
I started off in environmental science. I got a master's degree in that. And I worked for 12 years with the Environmental Protection Agency after that in the pesticide section out of the Region 4 office in Atlanta. Okay. Then I decided to return and get my PhD in forestry and natural resources from University of Georgia Warnell.
Nice.
And I also did my postdoc there. Then I found my way to Mississippi State because they were looking for a professor to work in the Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation program, which is a multidisciplinary program. Gotcha. So I brought with me the background in forestry as well as background in federal regulation and environmental conservation. Okay.
So how long have you been here?
Since August of last year. Okay. So I'm relatively new.
Nice, nice. Okay. So you research beneficial invertebrate communities that live in the forest, correct? So what are those? What are beneficial invertebrates?
So beneficial invertebrates generally fall into 3 main groups. We talk about pollinators that are important for plant reproduction, also provide food sources for wildlife as well as for humans. Okay. We talk about predatory insects, which prey on pest species that plague our agriculture and forest systems and keep those populations of pest insects in check. We also have energy recyclers, or your detritivores, and your carrion beetles and things like that that help with nutrient cycling in the system. So all of these invertebrates have really critical roles in the ecosystem. And we're starting to sort of turn our attention to how our forest management practices affect all of these beneficial invertebrates. In the past, there's been a lot more focus on the detrimental invertebrates, which are the ones that cause either economic or ecological damage, right? So the southern pine beetle, for example, that you may hear a lot about, causes a lot of economic damage in commercial forests. There's also invasive insects like the emerald ash borer or the hemlock woolly adelgid, for example, that are more ecological pests, where they're really, because they don't have any natural predators here, they're really decimating our ash and hemlock trees. So those kinds of insects are the detrimental ones that really cause either economic or significant ecological damage that the field of forestry has been very focused on for the majority of the past. And we're starting to shift toward recognizing we need to look at also the flip side of the equation, which is these insects that we actually depend on for a lot of ecosystem services within the forest, and that are also beneficial to humans in other ways, pollinating our crops and things like that, and how our forest practices impact those.
Gotcha. Okay. I was actually going to ask you about the harmful invertebrates, so thank you for sharing that. Are those issues with those harmful invertebrates regional? Like, do we only deal with that in the South, or is it different for different sections of our country?
Yeah, there are different pests in different parts of the country. In the Southeast, the 2 that I mentioned are probably the ones that get the most press, the emerald ash borer and the hemlock woolly adelgid. And there's other types of pests in other parts of the country. Gotcha. But once they're here, it's once they invade, it's really kind of an effort to keep them contained in certain areas, and keep them from spreading. However, that's very difficult to do. So often they will spread rapidly.
Understand. Okay. So we're going to talk about pollinators. So we often think about pollinators only benefiting from flowers. How much do forests contribute to quality habitat for pollinators?
And that's a great question, because and that's one of the things that I really like to focus on, because we do think that, obviously flowers are important for pollinators, and we all know that. And However, pollinators rely very heavily on a lot of forest resources, and that's something most people don't realize. Pollinators, in addition to the food resources that flowers provide, they need a variety of resources for nesting to complete their life cycles, right? So those resources can include things like detritus or leaf material. It can include resin. It can include dead wood, right? These are areas where, materials that insects use or that pollinators will use for nesting. There are a lot of pollinators, for example, that nest in snags or dead standing trees or dead stumps or wood lying on the ground, and they'll nest in cavities in the wood. They'll partition their nests with mud or with leaves or with resin. So most of these resources are found in the forest. In addition, in our southern forests, we have a lot of understory flowering plants that many of these bee species rely on, especially early in the season. So there are a number of resources that the forest provides that are really important for pollinators, and we have found, for example, that agricultural fields that are closer to a forest tend to have more pollination benefits because the insects are able to utilize the forest resources. That increases their diversity and their health, and so they also pollinate the agricultural fields.
Understand. So we use the word pollinators in our conversation, but for someone watching this show, they may not know what a pollinator is, or an example.
Right.
So what are some examples of pollinators?
So some examples of pollinators include bees. That's probably the biggest group of pollinators. We have over 4,000 species of wild bees in the United States alone.
Wow.
There are about 20,000 species worldwide. We tend to just focus on the honeybee, which is actually an imported species and considered a domestic species here in the U.S. Another example is butterflies. Moths are also pollinators. And really, there are a lot of other groups of insects that are also pollinators that people are less aware of, such as flies and mosquitoes can pollinate. Some beetles are pollinators as well.
Nice. So your research looks at the effects of various environmental factors on those beneficial invertebrates that we talked about. What factors are you researching?
So we're mainly researching managed forests currently. So we're looking really at harvesting intervals. We're looking at forest regeneration after harvest and how the bee communities respond to that. We've been doing some research also on herbicide use and the indirect effects of herbicide use, which herbicides are commonly used in forestry for site prep. And we're going to be looking also at burning, excuse me, and all of the different management things that we use in forests, and how do our pollinators respond to those. Once we understand that, we can really make intentional decisions about how we manage our forests, about how frequently we burn or what intensity we burn with and things like that. Using herbicides or not using herbicides and things like that that will improve pollinator populations in the forest.
So you talked about ways that we're impacting the forest, prescribed burns and things like that. But what about natural disturbances that occur?
Yes, that's another thing I've been getting into is looking at what we call catastrophic wind disturbances, which are things like tornadoes and hurricanes. And these sorts of events impact the forests, obviously, in a myriad of ways, right? And so one of the things that we're wanting to delve into is how do the invertebrate communities respond to these wind events? What is the kind of acute response in the communities, and also what happens afterwards? In the following years, how do the communities regenerate after a catastrophic wind disturbance? So we're looking at kind of both the immediate economic impacts as well as the long-term impacts of hurricanes, tornado events, things like that. These events, may be intensifying as a result of climate change. We all know we've had some, really bad hurricane seasons in the Southeast in recent years. So we're really trying to understand more about how those events may be interacting with the forest ecosystem.
Understand. Okay, switching gears. So I understand you're a professor, so you teach classes and you're an academic advisor. So how's that experience been in terms of advising students?
I love advising students.
Oh, yeah?
It's one of my favorite things. And I'm just getting started, so
Okay.
you know, I haven't had the chance to advise a lot of students at Mississippi State yet, but the handful of students that I have had the chance to advise, it is one of my strengths, I think. I really enjoy kind of helping guide a student's career, guide a student's thought process through a thesis, for example. So yeah, it's been a great experience.
Okay. So if we have prospective students watching our show, or parents who may have middle school students or high school students, and they're thinking about potential careers or fields that they want to consider, they may hear about STEM-related fields out there. Would you consider natural resources a STEM field?
I would consider natural resources a STEM field for sure, yes.
So what would your advice be for some of these parents and students?
Well, I think my main advice is to, you know, get outside.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to interact with the natural world. It stimulates curiosity. It helps you come up with questions about what's going on. Why am I observing this? Why am I observing that? And also, you know, I think the current generation, I feel like, has a lot of concern, excuse me, about the things that they see happening in the natural world.
Right.
They're growing up with climate change as a reality. And this field is an opportunity for them to really contribute to making a real difference in how we manage our natural resources moving forward as the climate changes, and you know what we can do to really help solve the issues.
So as we think about the possibilities, is it safe to say that career opportunities will increase over the next decade or
I
future
believe
decades?
so, yes. I think the career opportunities have been on the increase in natural resources, again, you know, because of the myriad of problems that we're facing and challenges that we're facing with regards to our natural resources. We're going to continue to need more and more professionals entering the field.
Okay. Well, Dr. Fortune, it has definitely been a pleasure to learn more about you, to learn more about your research and learn about your experience teaching classes and advising students. I know from a personal standpoint, engaging with students for over 15 years has definitely been a passion of mine. And so it definitely sounds like we share that passion. So
sure.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Yes, thank you so much.
That is our show today. We thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Renew.